Marcus Chen had always trusted his instincts. They'd kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan, guided him through the chaos of single parenthood, and landed him steady work as a security consultant for Phoenix's wealthiest families. But nothing had prepared him for the moment he would burst through the mahogany doors of the Whitmore estate and find himself staring into the terrified eyes of 2 6-year-old children he'd never met, while their kidnapper pressed a knife to the throat of a woman whose face haunted his dreams. The woman was older now, her auburn hair shorter, lines of stress etched around eyes that once sparkled with laughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But even after 8 years of silence, even with fear twisting her features, Marcus would have recognized Rebecca Whitmore anywhere. She was still the college sweetheart, who'd walked away from their engagement without explanation, leaving behind only a note that said she couldn't be the woman he needed her to be. What she hadn't left behind, apparently, were the twin daughters she'd never told him about. The morning that would change everything began like any other Tuesday in Marcus Chen's carefully ordered world. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 sharp in the small duplex he shared with his 15-year-old daughter Sophie on the outskirts of Scottsdale. The Arizona sun hadn't yet painted the desert horizon, but Marcus was already moving through his routine with military precision. Coffee first, black and strong enough to cut through the lingering remnants of another restless night. Then 20 minutes of push-ups, sit-ups, and stretching to keep his 42-year-old body ready for whatever his job as a private security consultant might demand. Sophie stumbled into the kitchen just as he was packing his lunch, her dark hair a tangled mess that somehow still managed to look stylish in that way only teenagers could achieve. She grabbed a granola bar from the counter and shot him a look that managed to convey both affection and mild exasperation. "Another rich family emergency?" she asked, nodding toward the tactical vest hanging by the door. Marcus smiled despite himself. His daughter had inherited his ability to read situations quickly, though she used hers mostly to navigate high school drama rather than potential security threats. "Mrs. Patterson's art collection needs babysitting while she hosts some charity auction. Should be quiet." Sophie rolled her eyes as she slung her backpack over her shoulder. "Right, because nothing ever goes wrong when you say it should be quiet." She paused at the door, her expression softening. "Just be careful, Dad. I worry about you taking all these solo jobs." The concern in her voice tugged at something in Marcus's chest. Sophie had been barely 7 when her mother died in a car accident, leaving them to figure out life together. In the years since, she'd become his anchor, the reason he'd left active military duty to pursue steadier, safer work. The irony wasn't lost on him that keeping wealthy strangers safe had become his way of keeping his own family secure. "Always am, kiddo. Text me when you get to school." An hour later, Marcus pulled his weathered pickup truck through the gates of the Whitmore estate in Paradise Valley. The property sprawled across 15 acres of pristine desert landscape, its main house a testament to southwestern luxury with soaring glass walls and red stone that seemed to glow in the morning light. He'd been here once before, 3 months ago, to conduct a security assessment for Rebecca Whitmore's insurance company, standard procedure for anyone with a net worth that attracted the wrong kind of attention. What hadn't been standard was the way his hands had shaken when he'd first seen her name on the client list. Rebecca Hartley, as she'd been known in college, had been his entire world from sophomore year until the day she'd vanished from it without warning. They'd planned a life together, picked out rings, talked about the house they'd buy after graduation. Then one morning he'd woken up to find her gone, taking nothing but her clothes and leaving behind a letter that had shattered his understanding of everything they'd shared. "I can't be who you need me to be," she'd written in handwriting he'd memorized from hundreds of love notes passed between classes. "You deserve someone who can give you the life you're planning. I'm not that person. Please don't look for me." He'd looked anyway, of course. Called her parents, her friends, even hired a private investigator with money he'd borrowed from his army signing bonus. But Rebecca Hartley had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving Marcus to piece together a future that no longer included the woman he'd been certain was his forever. The security assessment 3 months ago had been torture disguised as professionalism. Rebecca, now going by her married name of Whitmore, had been polite but distant, treating him like any other contractor. She'd shown no sign of recognition when he'd introduced himself, though he'd caught her staring at his hands when she thought he wasn't looking. Those hands had once traced the curve of her spine in their tiny apartment near campus, had held hers during long walks through the park, where they'd planned their impossible dreams. But she'd worn a wedding ring that day, and he'd noticed the family photos scattered throughout the house. A tall silver-haired man who looked like he belonged on a country club brochure. Two identical little girls with Rebecca's green eyes and stubborn chin, the life she'd chosen instead of the one they'd planned together. Marcus had completed his assessment, submitted his report, and tried to convince himself that seeing her again had finally given him the closure he'd never realized he needed. They were different people now, living in different worlds. Whatever they'd had was ancient history, except now he was back, called in by Rebecca's assistant because the regular security team was dealing with a family emergency. Just for the day, they'd said. Just to keep an eye on things while Mrs. Whitmore worked from home and the children played in their elaborate backyard playground. The house was quiet when he arrived, too quiet for a home with 6-year-old twins. Marcus parked near the service entrance and made his way to the security office, a small room tucked behind the kitchen where monitors displayed feeds from cameras positioned throughout the property. Everything looked normal. The gates were secure, the perimeter alarms armed, no unusual activity on any of the screens. He was reviewing the overnight logs when he heard it. A sound that made his blood turn to ice, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. A child screaming. Marcus was moving before conscious thought kicked in, his hand automatically reaching for the weapon holstered at his hip as he sprinted through the house toward the sound. The scream came again, followed by a man's voice, harsh and commanding, speaking words Marcus couldn't make out over the thunder of his own heartbeat. He rounded the corner into the main living area and froze. The scene before him seemed to exist in slow motion, every detail burning itself into his memory with crystal clarity. Two little girls, identical except for the length of their braids, huddled together on the marble floor near the massive stone fireplace. Their faces were streaked with tears, their small bodies trembling with the kind of terror that would leave scars long after the physical danger passed. Standing over them was a man Marcus didn't recognize, tall and wiry with the kind of lean muscle that came from hard living rather than gym memberships. He wore dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but what commanded Marcus's attention was the knife in his right hand, and the woman he held pressed against his chest with his left arm. Rebecca, even with 8 years of distance between them, even with fear transforming her features, she was unmistakably the woman who had once been the center of his universe. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore the kind of casual clothes that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, but her eyes held the same intelligence and fire that had first drawn him to her across a crowded lecture hall. Those eyes found his now, wide with a mixture of terror and something else. Recognition maybe, or just the desperate hope that salvation had finally arrived. The kidnapper's head snapped toward Marcus, the knife shifting slightly away from Rebecca's throat. "Stay right there," the man snarled, his voice carrying the harsh rasp of a longtime smoker. "Another step and she dies." Marcus raised his hands, his mind racing through options and scenarios. The man was holding Rebecca too close for a clean shot, and the children were in the potential line of fire. The knife was steady in the kidnapper's grip, suggesting either training or experience with violence. This wasn't some desperate amateur. This was someone who knew what he was doing. "Okay," Marcus said, keeping his voice level and non-threatening. "Nobody needs to get hurt here. What do you want?" The kidnapper's eyes darted between Marcus and the children, calculating. "I want what's mine," he said. "What this rich bitch owes me." Rebecca made a small sound, half sob and half protest, but didn't speak. Her eyes remained locked on Marcus, and he could see her trying to communicate something urgent. Her gaze flicked toward the children, then back to him, a message he understood without words. "Save them first. Whatever else happens, save them first." "Let's talk about this," Marcus continued, taking a half step to his left, angling for a better position. Money problems can be solved. Nobody needs to die over money. The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. Money. This isn't about money, soldier boy. This is about family. About what happens when rich people think they can just walk away from their responsibilities. Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. The way the man was looking at the children, the possessive anger in his voice. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was personal. Rebecca's eyes were fixed on his, and he could read the desperate message there as clearly as if she'd spoken aloud. This man wasn't just threatening her and the children. He was claiming them, claiming ownership of some kind, as if they belonged to him. The twins, who had been silent since his arrival, suddenly stirred. One of them, the girl with slightly longer braids, looked directly at Marcus with eyes that were unmistakably Rebecca's. "Are you here to help us?" she whispered, her voice so small it barely carried across the room. The kidnapper's grip tightened on Rebecca, the knife pressing closer to her skin. "Shut up, Emma. Don't talk to him." Emma. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd always loved that name, had mentioned it once during one of those late-night conversations where he and Rebecca had talked about their future children. She'd smiled and said it was perfect, had made him promise they'd name their first daughter Emma, if they were blessed with one. Looking at the child now, at the stubborn set of her jaw, and the way she held herself protectively in front of her sister despite her own fear, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. The professional distance he maintained in these situations crumbled, replaced by something far more dangerous and far more personal. These weren't just victims he was paid to protect. These were children who shared Rebecca's eyes and expressions, who had been given names from dreams he'd thought were buried forever. "I'm here to help," he told Emma, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "You and your sister both." "What's your sister's name?" "I'm Zoe," the other twin said, her voice slightly steadier than her sister's. She had the same green eyes, the same determined chin, but where Emma seemed to lead, Zoe clearly preferred to observe and analyze. "That man says he's our daddy, but Mommy says he's lying." The kidnapper's face darkened. "I'm not lying, you little brat. I'm exactly who I say I am, and it's time your mother stopped pretending otherwise." Rebecca found her voice then hoarse with fear but steady with conviction. "You're not their father, Derek. You never were. The tests proved that years ago." Derek. The name clicked into place in Marcus's memory. Derek Hawkins, small-time criminal, with a history of domestic violence and extortion. Rebecca's assistant had mentioned him during the security briefing months ago, flagged as a potential threat due to his claims about the children's paternity. Claims that had been legally disproven but that he'd never stopped making. "Tests can be faked," Derek snarled. "Rich people fake everything when it suits them, but I know what I know, and I know those girls are mine." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't a man operating from logic or even greed. This was someone whose entire sense of identity had become wrapped up in a delusion that he couldn't let go of, no matter what evidence contradicted it. Marcus had seen men like Derek before, usually in war zones where the combination of trauma and isolation could twist reality into shapes that bore no resemblance to truth. They were among the most dangerous opponents because they couldn't be reasoned with. Their version of reality was the only one that mattered, and they'd fight to the death to defend it. "Okay, Derek," Marcus said, using the man's name deliberately to establish a connection. "I can see this is important to you. Family is everything, right? So let's figure out how to handle this without anyone getting hurt." Derek's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know you're just buying time until backup arrives? I've been planning this for months. I know exactly how long it takes for the cops to get here, and I know these rich people have private security that can respond faster." He was right, of course. Marcus had already triggered a silent alarm when he'd first entered the room, and Phoenix PD would be en route, along with the backup security team. But Derek clearly had an exit strategy, which meant he was planning to be gone long before help arrived, which meant he was planning to take someone with him. Rebecca seemed to realize this at the same moment Marcus did. Her body tensed against Derek's grip, and Marcus saw her subtly shift her weight, preparing for something. "Don't," Marcus said quietly. The word meant for her but spoken so softly that Derek wouldn't hear. Rebecca's eyes met his, and he shook his head almost imperceptibly. Whatever she was planning, it was too risky with the knife so close to her throat, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. Her attention had shifted to something behind him, and Marcus saw her eyes widen slightly. Not with fear but with calculation. Emma saw it too. The 6-year-old's gaze flicked toward whatever had caught her mother's attention, and Marcus watched understanding pass between mother and daughter in the way that only happened in families who had learned to communicate in silence. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder and saw what they'd noticed. The morning sun was hitting the massive windows that made up the room's west wall, and the angle was creating a blinding reflection off the glass coffee table positioned near the fireplace. In about 30 seconds, when the sun moved just a fraction more, that reflection would hit Derek directly in the eyes. 30 seconds, long enough for a plan to form, but not long enough to communicate it to anyone else. Marcus made his choice. "You know what, Derek," he said, raising his voice slightly and taking a step forward. "You're right. These rich people do think they can just walk away from their responsibilities. Must be frustrating, having people with money and lawyers make you feel powerless." Derek's attention focused entirely on Marcus, exactly as intended. "Damn right, it's frustrating. You think money makes you better than everyone else, but it doesn't. It just makes you better at hiding the truth." "What truth is that?" Marcus asked, taking another small step. The reflection was building, the light growing brighter as the sun continued its path across the sky. "The truth that those girls are mine," Derek said, his voice rising. "The truth that Rebecca has been keeping them from me for 6 years, poisoning them against their own father." 20 seconds. Rebecca had caught on to what Marcus was doing. He could see her preparing herself, her body coiling like a spring despite Derek's grip on her. "That must hurt," Marcus continued, his voice full of false sympathy. "Being kept from your children by someone who thinks she knows better. You have no idea," Derek spat. "No idea what it's like to watch your kids grow up in pictures on social media, to see them living in this palace while you can't even afford a decent apartment." 10 seconds. Emma and Zoe had moved closer together, instinctively seeking comfort in each other's presence. They were good kids, Marcus realized, smart and brave in the way children had to be when the adults in their lives couldn't protect them from everything. 5 seconds. "But you're here now," Marcus said. "You're taking control, showing them who's really in charge." Derek smiled, and it was the most chilling expression Marcus had ever seen. "Exactly. And when we walk out of here together, they'll finally understand that family is everything. That blood matters more than money." The sun hit the coffee table. Light exploded across the room like a flashbang grenade, and Derek threw his hands up instinctively to shield his eyes. Rebecca tore away from him in that split second of blindness, diving toward her daughters as Marcus launched himself forward. Derek recovered faster than Marcus had hoped, the knife slashing through the air where Rebecca had been just moments before. But his eyes were still adjusting to the sudden brightness, and his swing went wide. Marcus tackled him around the waist, both men hitting the marble floor hard enough to drive the breath from their lungs. The knife skittered across the polished stone, spinning toward the fireplace. Derek scrambled after it, but Marcus grabbed his ankle and hauled him backward. They rolled across the floor, each fighting for position. Years of military training, warring against desperate strength and the absolute refusal to lose. Derek was stronger than he looked, wiry muscle hiding surprising power. He managed to flip Marcus onto his back and drove an elbow toward his throat, but Marcus twisted at the last second and the blow caught his shoulder instead. Pain shot down his arm, but he used Derek's momentum against him, rolling them both toward the wall. Somewhere behind them, Rebecca was shepherding the twins toward the kitchen, her voice a steady stream of reassurance that Marcus couldn't make out over the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. The important thing was that they were moving, getting distance between themselves and the violence. Derek broke free and lunged for the knife again. Marcus caught him around the waist and they both went down hard, Derek's forehead connecting with the stone hearth with a sickening crack. For a moment he went limp, and Marcus thought the fight was over. Then Derek's hand closed around the knife handle. He swung it in a vicious arc that would have opened Marcus's throat if not for combat reflexes that made him jerk backward. The blade caught the front of his shirt instead,
parting fabric and leaving a thin line of fire across his chest. Derek pressed his advantage, driving forward with the knife extended. But desperation made him sloppy, and Marcus had trained for exactly this scenario countless times. He caught Derek's wrist with both hands and twisted, applying pressure to the joint until Derek's grip loosened and the knife fell again. This time, Marcus kicked it away, sending it sliding across the floor toward the kitchen where Rebecca and the girls had disappeared. Derek tried to follow the weapon, but Marcus tackled him from behind, driving him face first into the floor. This time, Derek didn't get back up. The impact with the hearth had done more damage than Marcus initially realized, and combined with the exertion of the fight, it had finally taken its toll. Marcus zip-tied Derek's hands behind his back with restraints from his tactical vest, then checked his pulse, steady but weak. He'd live, but he wouldn't be threatening anyone for a while. The house had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the oppressive stillness of fear, but the hollow aftermath of violence, when adrenaline begins to fade and reality starts to reassert itself. Marcus found Rebecca and the twins in the kitchen, huddled together behind the massive granite island. The girls were clinging to their mother, their earlier bravery replaced by the delayed shock that often followed traumatic events. Rebecca's arms were wrapped protectively around both children, but her eyes were alert and scanning, ready to move again if necessary. "It's over," Marcus told her, staying near the doorway to give them space. "Derek's unconscious and restrained. Police and paramedics are on the way." Rebecca's shoulders sagged with relief, but she didn't let go of the twins. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the tear in his shirt where Derek's knife had found its mark. Marcus looked down at the thin line of blood seeping through the fabric. "Just a scratch. Nothing that won't heal." The twins peered at him over their mother's arms, their identical green eyes wide with curiosity and residual fear. "You're really good at fighting," Emma said, her voice small but admiring. "I used to be a soldier," Marcus explained, crouching down to bring himself to their eye level. "Fighting was part of my job, but the most important part was protecting people who needed help." "Like us?" Zoe asked. "Exactly like you." Rebecca was studying his face, and Marcus could see recognition dawning in her expression. She'd been too terrified earlier to process what her eyes were seeing, but now, with the immediate danger past, the impossible reality was sinking in. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "Marcus Chen," he nodded, unsure of what else to say. "What do you say to the woman who walked away from your shared future, when that future has somehow led you both to this moment?" "I don't understand," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger. "What are you doing here? How did you find us?" "I didn't find you," Marcus said quietly. "I'm working security. Your regular team had an emergency, so the company called me in as backup." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. After 8 years of silence, after building completely separate lives, random chance had put Marcus in exactly the right place to save the woman who had once meant everything to him. And her daughters. Daughters who had names from dreams they'd once shared, who had Rebecca's eyes and expressions that reminded him of late-night conversations about the children they'd someday raise together. The paramedics arrived first, followed closely by Phoenix PD and the backup security team. The next hour passed in a blur of statements and medical checks, with Derek being loaded into an ambulance under police guard and the crime scene being photographed and documented. Through it all, Marcus found himself watching Rebecca and the twins, noting the way they moved together like a unit that had learned to depend on each other completely. The girls were remarkably composed for 6-year-olds who had just lived through a kidnapping attempt, but he could see the trust they placed in their mother, the absolute confidence that she would keep them safe. It was the kind of family bond that took years to build, forged through shared experiences and unconditional love, the kind of family Marcus had once dreamed of having with Rebecca, before she decided he wasn't the man who could give her the life she needed. Detective Sarah Martinez, a compact woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, took Marcus's statement last. She was thorough and professional, asking all the right questions about Derek's behavior and motivations. "You did good work today," she told him as they finished. "Without your intervention, this could have gone very differently." Marcus nodded, accepting the praise without really hearing it. His attention was focused on Rebecca, who was sitting on the living room sofa with Emma and Zoe pressed against her sides. She'd been quiet since the police arrived, answering questions when asked but otherwise just holding her daughters and staring at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read. Detective Martinez followed his gaze. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned that you two have history together. College sweethearts, she said. Something like that, Marcus replied. Must have been strange walking into this situation and finding your ex-fiancée in danger. Marcus looked at the detective sharply.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rebecca hadn't mentioned their engagement to anyone in years. As far as he knew, for her to have shared that detail with a stranger suggested she was more shaken by seeing him again than she was letting on. Strange doesn't begin to cover it, he said. Detective Martinez studied him for a moment, then closed her notebook. Well, whatever history you two have, she's lucky you were here today. Derek Hawkins has been escalating his harassment for months. We've arrested him twice, but he kept making bail and coming back. This time with the kidnapping and assault charges, he won't be getting out anytime soon. She left to finish her paperwork, and Marcus found himself alone with Rebecca and the twins for the first time since the chaos had ended. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 8 years of unasked questions and unspoken words. We should talk, Rebecca said finally. Her voice carefully neutral. Marcus nodded. We should, but not today. Today is about making sure the girls are okay. Emma looked up at her mother. Mommy, is this the Marcus from your pictures? Rebecca's cheeks flushed slightly. What pictures, sweetheart? The ones in the box in your closet, Zoe chimed in. The pictures from before you married Daddy James. Emma and I found them when we were looking for Halloween decorations. Rebecca's flush deepened, but she didn't deny it. Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the knowledge that she'd kept photos of them together, that some part of their shared past had survived the years of separation. Yes, Rebecca told her daughters quietly. This is that Marcus. Emma studied him with the intense curiosity that 6-year-olds brought to everything new and interesting. Are you the one Mommy writes letters to but never sends? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He saw Rebecca's face go pale, saw her struggle for words that wouldn't come. Emma, she said finally, her voice strained. That's private, but the damage was done. The revelation hung in the air between them, changing the entire context of their reunion. Rebecca hadn't just walked away 8 years ago and never looked back. She'd thought about him, maybe even missed him, enough to write letters she could never bring herself to send. The twins seemed oblivious to the emotional earthquake their innocent question had triggered. They were more interested in examining Marcus's tactical vest and asking about his equipment. Do you have a gun? Zoe asked with the directness only children could manage. I do, Marcus replied. But it's only for emergencies to protect people who can't protect themselves. Like today, Emma said matter-of-factly. Like today, a new silence fell, this one less fraught but no less meaningful. Marcus found himself studying the twins more closely, looking for traces of the father who wasn't Derek Hawkins. They had Rebecca's eyes and expressions, but their bone structure was different. Stronger maybe. More defined. Actually, now that he looked at them properly, really looked, there was something familiar about the shape of their faces. Something that reminded him of his own baby pictures, or the childhood photos of his younger brother that their mother had kept on the mantel. But that was impossible. Rebecca had been married to someone else when the twins were born. Someone named James, according to what Zoe had said. The girls were 6 years old, which meant they'd been conceived roughly 7 years ago, just 1 year after Rebecca had left him. Unless, Marcus felt his breath catch as the timeline rearranged itself in his mind. 7 years ago, Rebecca would have been married for less than a year. The twins' bone structure, their mannerisms, even the stubborn set of their jaws when they'd faced down Derek's threats. He looked at Rebecca, and saw his own realization reflected in her eyes. The secret she'd been carrying, the reason she'd never sent those letters, the truth that had been staring him in the face since the moment he'd walked into this room. Emma and Zoe weren't just children he'd saved from a kidnapper. They were his daughters. The 3 days that followed the kidnapping attempt passed in a haze of police interviews, insurance claims, and security upgrades. Marcus found himself returning to the Whitmore estate each morning, officially hired as the temporary head of Rebecca's personal protection detail, while the regular team dealt with their family crisis. Unofficially, he couldn't stay away from the questions that had been eating at him since that moment of recognition in the living room. Emma and Zoe were his daughters. The certainty of it had settled into his bones like an ache that wouldn't fade. Every time he looked at them, he saw echoes of his own childhood, reflections of the Chen family features that had been passed down through generations. The way Emma tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something. The stubborn set of Zoe's jaw when she disagreed with an adult. Even the way they moved together, always conscious of each other's position, reminded him of how he and his younger brother had navigated their childhood as a team. But knowing and understanding were two different things entirely. Rebecca had been avoiding him with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of polite distance. She answered his security-related questions with professional courtesy, consulted with him about schedule changes and transportation logistics, and made sure he had everything he needed to do his job effectively. What she didn't do was give him 5 minutes alone to ask the questions that were burning holes in his sleep. On Thursday morning, Marcus arrived at the estate to find the twins in the backyard with their tutor, a patient woman named Mrs. Garcia who had been working with them since the divorce 2 years earlier. Rebecca had mentioned that the girls were homeschooled now, a decision made after James Whitmore's death had attracted too much media attention for them to attend regular classes without constant harassment from photographers and reporters. James Whitmore. Even the name left a bitter taste in Marcus's mouth, though he tried to keep his feelings about Rebecca's deceased husband separate from his professional obligations. From what he'd learned through background checks and casual conversation, James had been 15 years older than Rebecca, a tech entrepreneur who had built his fortune in software development, before diversifying into real estate and venture capital. He died in a skiing accident in Aspen, leaving behind a business empire worth close to $2 billion, and a family trust that would ensure Emma and Zoe never wanted for anything. Marcus watched the girls through the kitchen window as he reviewed the security footage from the previous night. They were working on what looked like a science project, something involving magnets and metal filings, that had them both completely absorbed. Mrs. Garcia sat nearby, available for guidance, but letting them explore and discover on their own. It was exactly the kind of educational approach he and Rebecca had talked about during those late-night conversations in college. She'd been studying child development then, fascinated by the way children learned best through hands-on experience, rather than rote memorization. He'd been pursuing his degree in international relations, but he'd loved listening to her theories about education and child psychology. Seeing those theories put into practice with children who might be his own created a strange ache in his chest, a sense of loss for experiences he'd never even known he was missing. "They're remarkable kids," a voice said behind him. Marcus turned to find Rebecca standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a coffee mug in both hands like it was an anchor. Smart, resilient, curious about everything. Even after what happened on Tuesday, they're already asking when they can go back to their normal routine. This was the most personal thing she'd said to him since the kidnapping, and Marcus felt something shift in the carefully maintained distance between them. "They handled the situation better than most adults would have," he said. Emma's quick thinking with the distraction technique, and the way Zoe stayed calm and observant throughout the whole thing. Those are learned skills, not natural instincts. Someone taught them how to stay safe in dangerous situations. Rebecca's smile was tinged with sadness. "When you're worth $2 billion, your children become targets whether you want them to or not. I had them trained in basic safety protocols as soon as they were old enough to understand. How to recognize danger, how to follow instructions from security personnel, how to stay together and protect each other." She set down her coffee mug and moved to stand beside him at the window. This close, Marcus could smell her perfume, something light and floral that was completely different from the vanilla scent she'd worn in college. Everything about her had changed, he realized. Her clothes, her hair, her mannerisms. Even the way she carried herself was different, more controlled and guarded.
But when she looked at the twins, her expression softened into something that was purely Rebecca, the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Marcus," she said quietly, not looking at him. "We need to talk. Really talk. But not here. Not where they might overhear." He nodded, his pulse quickening. "Tonight, after they're in bed. Meet me in the garden around 9. The rest of the day passed with excruciating slowness. Marcus threw himself into security protocols, reviewing camera placements and updating emergency procedures with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Anything to keep his mind occupied and away from the 1,000 different scenarios of how the evening's conversation might unfold. At lunch he found himself eating with Emma and Zoe on the back patio, answering their endless questions about military life and security work. They were fascinated by his stories about different countries he'd visited, and cultures he'd encountered, hanging on every word with the kind of focused attention that reminded him painfully of Rebecca at their age. "Did you ever get scared when you were fighting bad guys?" Emma asked, picking the tomatoes out of her sandwich with surgical precision. "All the time," Marcus answered honestly. "Fear is normal. It's what keeps you alive in dangerous situations. The trick is not letting the fear stop you from doing what needs to be done." Zoe looked up from her own lunch. "Is that why you helped us on Tuesday? Even though you were scared?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I wasn't scared of Derek," he said finally. "I was scared of what might happen to you and your sister if I didn't act fast enough. Sometimes the thing that scares us most is failing to protect the people who matter to us." The twins exchanged a look that seemed to carry entire conversations, one of those silent communications that only twins seem to master. Then Emma smiled, and it was like seeing Rebecca's college smile reflected in miniature. "We're glad you didn't let the fear stop you," she said simply. That evening, Marcus found himself pacing his small apartment like a caged animal. Sophie was at her friend's house working on a group project, which meant he had the place to himself to work through the nervous energy that had been building all day. He changed clothes 3 times before settling on jeans and a button-down shirt, then immediately second-guessed the choice. What did you wear to a conversation that might reveal you'd been a father for 6 years without knowing it? The Whitmore Estates garden was a masterpiece of desert landscaping, with winding paths that moved between carefully cultivated sections of native plants and modern sculpture. Marcus found Rebecca sitting on a stone bench near a fountain that cast dancing shadows in the moonlight. She'd changed from her daytime business attire into jeans and a soft sweater, and for just a moment, she looked like the college student he'd once known. "Thank you for coming," she said as he approached, her voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for finally agreeing to have this conversation." Marcus sat down on the opposite end of the bench, far enough away to give her space but close enough to see her face in the dim light. "I have questions, Rebecca." "A lot of them," she nodded, staring at the fountain. "I know you do. I've been trying to figure out where to start, how much to tell you, how much I have the right to tell you." "Start with the truth," Marcus said. "Are they mine?" Rebecca was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." The word hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting it. Knowing something intellectually, and hearing it confirmed were 2 entirely different experiences. Marcus felt his breath catch, felt the world shift slightly on its axis. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and he was surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Rebecca looked at him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I was 22 years old and terrified, and I thought I was doing what was best for everyone." Best for everyone. "Rebecca, you kept my children from me for 6 years. You let me think you'd walked away from our relationship because I wasn't good enough, when the real reason was that you were pregnant with my babies." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw Rebecca flinch. But 8 years of wondering what he'd done wrong, 8 years of thinking he'd somehow failed the woman he'd loved more than anything, deserved some honesty. "It wasn't that simple," Rebecca said, her own voice gaining strength. "When I found out I was pregnant, you'd already enlisted. You were leaving for basic training in 6 weeks, and then you'd be deployed overseas for who knew how long. I was looking at raising twins as a single mother while trying to finish college and find a way to support us all. Marcus felt his anger deflate slightly. He remembered those final weeks before shipping out, remembered the stress and uncertainty that had colored everything. But still, you could have told me. We could have figured it out together. With what money, Marcus? With what support system? Your family was 1,000 miles away. Mine had already made it clear they thought I was making a mistake by getting engaged so young. You were about to disappear into military training and then combat deployments. I would have been completely alone. Rebecca stood up and began pacing, her composed facade finally cracking. And then James appeared. He was older, established, financially secure. He offered me everything I thought I needed to give my children a stable life, a father who would be present, a home that was safe, education and opportunities and all the things I couldn't provide on my own. So you married him and let him raise my children. Marcus couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. I married him and he adopted the girls legally. Rebecca corrected. He loved them, Marcus. From the moment he met them, he loved them like they were his own. He was a good father, even if he wasn't their biological one. The past tense hit Marcus like a slap. James Whitmore was dead, had been dead for 2 years. Whatever role he'd played in the twins' lives, it was over now. Which meant Emma and Zoe had already lost one father figure, and now they were about to discover their real father had been a stranger all along. Do they know? He asked. Do they know James wasn't their biological father? Rebecca sat back down, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. No, James and I agreed we'd tell them when they were older, when they could understand the complicated circumstances. But then he died, and I couldn't bring myself to add that confusion to their grief. Marcus tried to imagine what the twins had gone through, losing the only father they'd ever known in a sudden accident. No wonder Rebecca had been so protective, so careful about their security and routines. They'd already experienced enough loss and trauma for several lifetimes. What about Derek? He asked. How does he fit into all of this? Rebecca's expression darkened. Derek was a mistake I made right after James died. I was grieving, not thinking clearly, and he was charming and attentive when I needed someone to listen. We dated for about 3 months before I realized he was more interested in my money than in me. She rubbed her temples, as if the memory gave her a headache. When I broke things off, he became obsessed with the idea that Emma and Zoe were his children. He said we'd been together long enough for it to be possible, and he refused to accept the timeline that proved otherwise. I had paternity tests done to legally establish that he had no claim to them, but he kept insisting the results were fake. And now he's facing kidnapping charges that should keep him locked up for years, Marcus said. Hopefully. But there will be others, Marcus. There always are when you have this much money. Men who think they can claim my children or my fortune through manipulation or force. It's why I've had to be so careful about who I let into their lives. The implications of that statement hung between them. Rebecca had spent 6 years protecting Emma and Zoe from exactly the kind of complications their biological father might represent. Marcus was a security consultant who lived paycheck to paycheck, raising his own teenage daughter in a duplex that probably cost less per month than Rebecca spent on groceries. What could he offer the twins that they didn't already have? But then he remembered the way Emma and Zoe had looked at him during the kidnapping. The trust they'd placed in a complete stranger simply because he'd appeared when they needed help. He thought about the questions they'd asked over lunch, the way they'd listened to his stories with complete attention. I want to know them, he said quietly. I want to be part of their lives if they'll let me. Rebecca studied his face in the moonlight. It's not that simple. They think James was their father. They're still grieving him. How do I explain that the man they've known as Daddy wasn't actually related to them, but this stranger who works security is? The same way you explained that Derek wasn't their father when he was claiming to be, Marcus said, with honesty and age-appropriate details. Kids are more resilient than adults think they are. And what about the media attention? The questions about why I kept their paternity secret for so long. The implications for James's reputation and the company he built. There are shareholders and board members and legal complications you can't imagine. Marcus could see the weight of those concerns in the tension of Rebecca's shoulders, in the way she kept glancing back toward the house, as if expecting photographers to emerge from the shadows. This wasn't just about two parents figuring out how to co-parent their children. This was about a business empire, and public image, and the kind of wealth that made every personal decision a potential headline. "I'm not asking you to hold a press conference," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to get to know my daughters, to be present in their lives in whatever way works for everyone involved." Rebecca was quiet again, and Marcus found himself holding his breath while she considered. Finally she turned to face him fully. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "Something that complicates everything even more." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What?" Rebecca took a deep breath. "The reason I write those letters Emma mentioned, the ones I never send. It's not just because I miss what we had, Marcus. It's because James knew. He knew from the beginning that the twins weren't his biologically, and he knew who their real father was." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "He knew about me? I told him everything before we got married. I thought he deserved to know what he was taking on, and I wanted to be sure he could love the girls knowing they weren't his biological children." Rebecca's voice grew soft with memory. "He said it didn't matter. He said family wasn't about DNA. It was about love and commitment, and showing up every day." Marcus felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing about James's reaction. Gratitude that the man had loved his daughters so completely, but also a sharp jealousy that James had gotten to be their father while Marcus had been kept in the dark. "But he also made me promise something," Rebecca continued. "He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would find you and tell you the truth. He said the girls deserved to know their biological father, and you deserved to know you had children. Then why did it take a kidnapping attempt for me to find out?" Marcus asked, though he could hear the shift in his own voice. The anger was fading, replaced by something more complex and harder to define. "Because I was a coward," Rebecca said simply. "Because telling you meant admitting I'd made the wrong choice 8 years ago. It meant facing the possibility that you'd hate me for keeping them from you, or that you'd want to take them away from me, or that they'd resent me for lying to them about their father." She stood up again, wrapping her arms around herself against the desert night chill. "But mostly, it meant admitting that I never stopped loving you, and that every choice I'd made since walking away had been an attempt to convince myself I could live without you." The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw and completely unexpected. Marcus stared at her, trying to process what she just said. "Rebecca, I'm not telling you this to complicate things more than they already are," she said quickly. "I'm telling you because you deserve the whole truth, not just the parts I'm comfortable sharing. Yes, the girls are your daughters. Yes, I kept them from you because I thought it was best. But I also kept them from you because I was afraid that if I contacted you, I'd realize I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." Marcus stood up and crossed to where she was standing by the fountain. This close he could see the tears she'd been holding back, could see the exhaustion and loneliness that lay beneath her carefully maintained composure. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying that seeing you again, watching you with Emma and Zoe, remembering what it felt like to have someone who would put their life on the line to protect the people they cared about." Rebecca looked up at him, her green eyes bright with emotion. "I'm saying that maybe James was wrong about one thing. Maybe family isn't just about showing up every day. Maybe it's also about the connection that exists before you even know you're connected." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Marcus could feel the pull of old attraction, old love complicated by years of separation and the revelation of shared children. This was dangerous territory, he knew. They were both vulnerable, both dealing with the emotional aftermath of trauma and revelation. But when Rebecca took a half step closer, when her eyes searched his face for some sign of what he was thinking, Marcus found himself remembering not just the pain of her leaving, but the joy of loving her in the first place. "The girls need stability," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "They need time to process everything that's happened, and they need to know that the adults in their lives are going to make decisions based on what's best for them, not on what's convenient for us." Rebecca nodded, stepping back slightly.
"You're right. Of course you're right." But Marcus continued, "That doesn't mean we can't figure this out. The three of us, and Sophie too. She's going to have questions about suddenly having two little sisters she's never met. Sophie. My daughter. She's 15, and she's been the center of my world since her mother died 7 years ago. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to build some kind of family structure that works for everyone, she's part of the equation too. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. She'd been so focused on the implications for Emma and Zoe that she hadn't considered the fact that Marcus had built his own family in the years since they'd separated. I'd like to meet her, Rebecca said. If she's open to it, the girls should know they have an older sister. Half-sister. Marcus corrected gently. But yeah, I think she'd like to meet them too. She's always wanted siblings. They stood there in the garden, the fountain providing a gentle soundtrack to their conversation, and Marcus felt something shift between them. Not resolution, exactly, but the beginning of possibility. The recognition that the situation was complicated and difficult, but not impossible. So what happens next? Rebecca asked. Next we take this one day at a time. Marcus said. We focus on the girls and what they need. We figure out how to tell them the truth in a way that doesn't shatter their understanding of their family. And we try to build something that works for everyone, even if it doesn't look like anything either of us planned. Rebecca smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and it was like seeing the sun come out from behind clouds. One day at a time, she agreed. As Marcus walked back to his truck, he found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he'd been a single father and security consultant living a quiet life in Scottsdale. Tonight, he was driving home to figure out how to tell his teenage daughter that she had 2 6-year-old half-sisters, and that the father she'd always known might be about to become part of something much more complicated and wonderful than either of them had ever imagined. The desert night was clear and star-filled, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when the sun had risen that morning. And for the first time in 8 years, Marcus Chen was beginning to believe that some mistakes could be forgiven, some lost things could be found, and some families could be built from the pieces of dreams that had once seemed broken beyond repair. Sophie Chen had always been able to read her father like an open book. So when Marcus came home from the Whitmore estate that night, with the expression of someone who'd just discovered the world was a completely different shape than he'd thought, she knew something major had shifted in their carefully ordered life. She was sitting at their small kitchen table, calculus homework spread out in front of her when he walked through the door. The way he stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds, just staring at her like he was memorizing her face, made her stomach clench with sudden worry. Dad? What's wrong? Did something happen at work? Marcus moved to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way they got when he was processing something big. We need to talk, Soph, about some things that are going to change our lives pretty significantly. Sophie closed her calculus book and gave him her full attention. In 15 years of life, most of them without a mother, she'd learned to recognize the moments when her father needed her to be mature beyond her years. This felt like one of those moments. Okay, I'm listening. Marcus sat down across from her at the table, the same table where they'd eaten countless meals together, where he'd helped her with homework and listened to her teenage dramas, where they'd made plans for her college applications and talked about her future. Now he was about to tell her that their family of 2 was about to become something much more complicated. Do you remember me telling you about Rebecca? The woman I was engaged to before your mom and I got together. Sophie nodded. She knew the basic story. Her father had been engaged to his college girlfriend, but it hadn't worked out. He'd met Sophie's mother, Julie, a few years later, and they'd gotten married and had Sophie before Julie's death in a car accident when Sophie was 7. Well, it turns out the situation with Rebecca was more complicated than I knew at the time. And this week, I discovered some things that are going to impact both of us. Marcus took a deep breath, and Sophie could see him choosing his words carefully. The family I've been providing security for this week, the woman whose children were almost kidnapped, that woman is Rebecca, and her twin daughters are my biological children. Your half-sisters. The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She stared at her father, waiting for the punchline, or the explanation that would make this make sense. When neither came, she felt her understanding of her family, her history, her entire life shift like tectonic plates beneath an earthquake. "I'm sorry." "What?" she said, her voice coming out higher than normal. "I know it's a shock. It's been a shock for me too. But the twin girls I helped save from that kidnapper, Emma and Zoe, they're 6 years old, and they're my daughters. Which makes them your sisters." Sophie stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the linoleum floor. She began pacing the small kitchen, her mind racing through the implications. "So you're telling me that for 6 years, I've had sisters I didn't know about? That there are 2 little girls out there who share half my DNA, and nobody bothered to mention this to me?" "Sophie, I didn't know. Rebecca never told me she was pregnant. She married someone else and let him adopt the girls. I found out the same time you're finding out." But Sophie was already 3 steps ahead, the way she always was when processing complex information. "Wait, if they're 6, and you and Mom got together when I was 2, that means Rebecca was pregnant when you were with Mom. Were you cheating on Mom?" The accusation hit Marcus like a slap. He could see the hurt and confusion in his daughter's eyes, the way she was trying to reconcile the father she'd always respected with this new information that seemed to paint him as someone completely different. "No," he said firmly. "Your mother and I didn't get together until 2 years after Rebecca left. The timeline doesn't overlap. Rebecca was already married and raising the twins when I met Julie." Sophie stopped pacing and stared at him. "So this woman just disappeared on you, took your kids, and let you think you'd never been a father. And now she's what? Back in your life? Are you going to try to be their dad now? Are we suddenly going to become some kind of blended family?" The bitter edge in Sophie's voice made Marcus's chest tight. His daughter had been his partner in building their life together, his closest confidant and the person whose opinion mattered most to him. Seeing her hurt and angry over something that wasn't her fault, something she had no control over, was almost worse than the initial shock of learning about the twins. "I don't know what's going to happen," he said honestly. "I don't know what kind of relationship I'll have with Emma and Zoe, or what role they'll play in our lives. But I do know that nothing changes between you and me. You're still my daughter, you're still my priority, and you're still the most important person in my world." Sophie's expression softened slightly, but he could see she was still processing, still working through the emotional minefield this revelation had created. "Do they know about me?" she asked. "Do they know they have an older sister?" "Not yet. Rebecca and I are still figuring out how to tell them they have a biological father they've never met. But yes, when we do tell them, they'll learn about you too." Sophie sat back down at the table, her calculus homework forgotten. "This is insane, Dad. Like completely insane. 3 days ago, our biggest worry was whether I'd get into ASU with my SAT scores. Now we're talking about secret siblings and baby mama drama." Marcus winced at the phrase baby mama drama, but he couldn't argue with Sophie's assessment of the situation's complexity. "I know it's a lot to process. It's a lot for me to process too. But these girls, Sophie, when you meet them you'll understand. They're smart and brave, and they've been through a lot of trauma. They could use a big sister. Could use a big sister," Sophie repeated, and Marcus could hear the wheels turning in her head. "What about what I could use? What about the fact that I've been an only child for 15 years, and suddenly I'm supposed to share my father with 2 kids who've been living in a mansion while we've been scraping by in this duplex?" The resentment in her voice was understandable, even justified. Sophie had grown up without a mother, had learned to be self-sufficient and mature beyond her years, had helped Marcus navigate single parenthood in ways that no teenager should have to. Now he was asking her to adjust to sharing his attention and affection with children she'd never met. But before Marcus could respond, Sophie's expression shifted. The anger faded, replaced by something that looked like guilt. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That was selfish. It's not their fault their mom kept them away from you. And it's not your fault you didn't know about them. You're allowed to be angry, Soph. You're allowed to feel however you feel about this. Your reaction isn't selfish, it's human." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Are you going to want to be with her again, Rebecca?" The question cut straight to the heart of Marcus's own confusion about the situation. His feelings for Rebecca were complicated, a tangle of old love and new resentment, of attraction and anger and the strange intimacy that came from shared children. "I don't know," he said, because it was the truth. "Right now we're focused on figuring out what's best for Emma and Zoe. Everything else is secondary. But she's the one who got away, right? The great love of your life that you never got over." Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing Julie's intelligence and insight reflected in Sophie's expression. Julie had always been able to cut through his emotional defenses with surgical precision, and apparently their daughter had inherited that particular talent. "She was important to me, yes, but that was a long time ago, and we're both different people now. Whatever happens between Rebecca and me, it won't change what you mean to me." Sophie nodded, but Marcus could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The introduction of Rebecca and the twins into their lives threatened the exclusive bond she'd shared with her father since her mother's death. It was natural for her to feel protective of that relationship. 3 days later, the delicate balance Marcus was trying to maintain between his old life and his new reality shattered completely. It started with a phone call from Rebecca, her voice tight with stress. "Marcus, I need you to come in early today. There's been a development with Derek's case, and my lawyer wants to meet with you." Marcus had been making breakfast for Sophie, their morning routine proceeding as normally as possible given the circumstances. Sophie was getting ready for school, moving through their small house with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to manage her own schedule from a young age. "What kind of development?" Marcus asked, switching the phone to speaker so he could continue scrambling eggs. "Apparently Derek's lawyer is claiming the kidnapping was justified, because he believed the twins were his biological children. They're demanding new paternity tests, and they want to subpoena the original test results from when I first had them done." Marcus felt cold dread settle in his stomach. If Derek's lawyer was digging into the twins' paternity, it was only a matter of time before they discovered the truth about Marcus being their biological father. And if that information became part of a legal proceeding, it would inevitably become public. "Rebecca, if they run new tests, I know, they'll discover you're the father, not Derek, and the whole situation becomes infinitely more complicated." Sophie looked up from her cereal, clearly catching the implications of the conversation. Her expression was a mixture of concern and something that might have been excitement at the prospect of meeting her half-sisters sooner than expected. "What does your lawyer recommend?" Marcus asked. "He wants to meet with all of us. You, me and Sophie too, since she'll be affected by whatever decision we make. Can you bring her by the estate after school today?" Marcus looked at his daughter, raising an eyebrow in question. Sophie nodded, her curiosity clearly outweighing her anxiety about the situation. "We'll be there by 4, Marcus said. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous energy and worst-case scenario planning. Marcus found himself checking news websites obsessively, looking for any sign that the story had leaked to the media. The last thing Emma and Zoe needed was to learn about their paternity from a newspaper headline or television report. When he picked Sophie up from school that afternoon, she was quieter than usual, staring out the window as they drove through Paradise Valley toward the Whitmore estate. "You nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if they don't like me? What if I say something wrong? What if I'm a terrible big sister?" Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're going to be fine. You're smart and kind and funny, and they're going to love you. But what if the whole situation is too weird? I mean, their mom and their dad used to be engaged. Then she married someone else and raised them in this mansion while we were living in a duplex. How do we even begin to bridge that gap?" It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had been wrestling with himself. The differences in their circumstances weren't just about money, though that was certainly a factor. They were about entirely different approaches to life, different values and priorities and ways of being in the world. The Whitmore estate looked even more impressive in the afternoon light, its red stone walls glowing against the desert landscape. Marcus drove through the gates,
noting the increased security presence since Derek's attempted kidnapping. There were more guards, more cameras, and a subtle but unmistakable sense of vigilance that hadn't been there before. Rebecca met them at the front door, and Marcus felt the same complicated mix of emotions he'd been experiencing every time he saw her. She was dressed in a tailored business suit, her auburn hair pulled back in a sleek bun, every inch the successful CEO. But when she looked at Sophie, her expression softened into genuine warmth. "You must be Sophie," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Rebecca. It's so nice to finally meet you." Sophie shook Rebecca's hand, and Marcus was proud to see that his daughter's natural poise carried her through the awkwardness of the moment. "Nice to meet you too, Mrs. Whitmore. Please call me Rebecca. We're family after all." The word family hung in the air, loaded with implications and possibilities that none of them were quite ready to unpack. Rebecca led them through the house toward her study, where they would meet with the lawyer and discuss their options. As they walked through the marble halls, Sophie's eyes took in everything with the sharp attention to detail she'd inherited from both her parents. Marcus could see her cataloging the artwork, the furniture, the obvious signs of wealth that surrounded them. This was a world so far removed from their duplex in Scottsdale, that it might as well have been on another planet. "Where are Emma and Zoe?" Marcus asked. "In the playroom with Mrs. Garcia," Rebecca replied. "I thought it would be better to have the legal discussion first, then figure out how to handle introductions." Rebecca's study was a warm, comfortable room lined with bookshelves and decorated with family photos. Marcus found himself looking at the pictures, seeing Emma and Zoe at various ages, always with James Whitmore's arm around them or Rebecca's hands on their shoulders. The images told the story of a happy family, complete and loving and utterly unaware that their foundation was built on a secret that was about to be exposed. David Morrison, Rebecca's lawyer, was a sharp-faced man in his 50s, who radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of handling complex legal situations. He shook hands with Marcus and Sophie, then got straight to business. "The situation is this," he said, spreading documents across Rebecca's desk. "Derek Hawkins's attorney has filed a motion demanding new paternity tests, claiming that the original results were somehow compromised or falsified. They're arguing that Derek had a reasonable belief that the twins were his children, which would justify his actions as a misguided but understandable attempt to reclaim his family." "That's ridiculous," Sophie said, speaking up for the first time since they'd arrived. "He kidnapped them. You don't get to kidnap people just because you think they might be related to you." Morrison smiled slightly at Sophie's directness. "You're absolutely right, Miss Chen. But in criminal law, the defendant's state of mind can be a mitigating factor in sentencing. If Derek's lawyer can establish that he genuinely believed the twins were his children, they might be able to reduce the charges from kidnapping to something less severe." Marcus felt his jaw clench. "So they're essentially saying that believing your own delusion gives you the right to terrorize children." "Not the right, no. But it might give him a defense that reduces his prison time." Morrison's expression was grim. "Which is why we need to decide how to handle the paternity issue. If we comply with the court order for new tests, the results will show that Derek is not the father. But they'll also reveal who the actual father is." Rebecca looked at Marcus, then at Sophie, her expression uncertain. "Which brings us to the question we've been avoiding. Are we ready for Emma and Zoe to learn the truth? Are we ready for the media attention that will inevitably follow? Are we ready for our private family business to become public fodder?" Sophie looked back and forth between the adults, clearly understanding that this decision would affect her life as much as anyone's. "What happens if we don't do the new tests?" "Derek's lawyer will claim we're hiding something," Morrison replied. "They'll argue that our refusal to cooperate suggests that the original tests were indeed falsified, which could actually help Derek's defense. And if we do comply with the tests, then the truth comes out. Marcus is identified as the biological father, and will have to deal with all the implications that follow." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated their options. Marcus could see Rebecca wrestling with the decision, weighing her desire to protect the twins against the legal realities they were facing. It was Sophie who broke the silence. "They deserve to know," she said quietly. "Emma and Zoe. They deserve to know who their real father is, regardless of what it means for the rest of us. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his daughter. Despite her own complicated feelings about the situation, she was putting the twins' well-being first. Sophie's right, he said. We can't build a family based on lies and secrets. The girls have already lost one father. They shouldn't have to lose the chance to know their biological father because we're afraid of complications. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring at the family photos on her desk. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. If we do this, there's no going back, she said. Once the truth is out, everything changes. The media will be all over the story. The twins will have to deal with questions about their parentage for the rest of their lives, and we'll all have to figure out how to navigate being a family under public scrutiny. We'll figure it out, Marcus said, reaching across the desk to take her hand. Whatever comes, we'll figure it out together. Morrison cleared his throat. There's one more thing you should know. I've been in touch with my contacts in the media, and there are already rumors circulating about the kidnapping, and Derek's claims about the twins' paternity. It's possible the story will break regardless of what we decide about the tests. The revelation hit like a bomb. They'd been operating under the assumption that they had time to control how the truth came out, time to prepare Emma and Zoe, and figure out the best way to handle the situation. If the media was already sniffing around, that time might have already run out. How long do we have? Rebecca asked. Could be hours, could be days, but not much longer than that. Sophie stood up abruptly. Then we need to tell them now. Emma and Zoe. They need to hear it from you, not from some reporter or news website. She looked at her father, then at Rebecca, her expression determined despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. And I want to meet them before this whole thing becomes a circus. I want to meet my sisters while we still have a chance to do it privately. Rebecca nodded, her decision finally made. Okay. We tell them today. We tell them everything, and then we prepare for whatever storm follows. Morrison began gathering his documents. I'll file our response to the court motion, and prepare a statement for the media. Try to control the narrative as much as possible. As the lawyer left, Marcus found himself alone with Rebecca and Sophie in the study. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation and fear, and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Are you ready for this? Rebecca asked Sophie. Meeting them is going to change everything for all of us. Sophie took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that reminded Marcus painfully of her mother. No, but I don't think anyone could be ready for this.
So let's just do it. Rebecca smiled. And for the first time since they'd arrived, she looked more like the young woman Marcus had fallen in love with in college and less like the guarded CEO she'd become. All right then, let's go meet your sisters. As they walked toward the playroom where Emma and Zoe were waiting with their tutor, Marcus felt the strange sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into free fall without knowing where or how he'd land. In a few minutes, two 6-year-old girls would learn that everything they'd believed about their family was wrong. Sophie would meet the half-sisters she'd never known existed, and all of them would have to figure out how to be a family while the world watched. But as terrifying as the unknown was, Marcus found himself grateful for one thing. They were about to face it together. The playroom at the Whitmore estate was a child's paradise, filled with natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and equipped with everything two curious 6-year-olds could want. Art supplies covered one table, building blocks were scattered across a colorful rug, and bookshelves lined the walls, packed with stories in multiple languages. Emma and Zoe were seated at a small round table, working on what appeared to be a puzzle featuring the solar system, their heads bent together in concentration. Mrs. Garcia, their tutor, looked up as Rebecca, Marcus and Sophie entered the room. She was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes, and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades working with children. She immediately sensed the tension in the adults, and quietly gathered her materials. "Girls, your mother needs to speak with you," she said gently. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." Emma and Zoe looked up from their puzzle, their identical green eyes taking in the three adults with the sharp perception children possessed when they knew something important was happening. Emma's gaze lingered on Sophie, clearly curious about the teenager she'd never seen before. "Mommy, who's the girl?" Zoe asked, her voice carrying the directness that 6-year-olds brought to every conversation. Rebecca sat down in one of the small chairs, bringing herself to the twins' eye level. Marcus remained standing near the window, his posture tense, while Sophie hovered near the doorway as if she might bolt at any moment. "This is Sophie," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "She's someone very special, and she's here because we need to talk about something important, something about your family." Emma abandoned the puzzle completely, turning in her chair to face her mother with complete attention. Zoe continued sorting puzzle pieces, but Marcus could see she was listening intently to every word. "Do you remember when that man Derek came here and said he was your father?" Rebecca continued. "And how we told you that wasn't true, that sometimes people say things that aren't real because they want something to be different than it actually is." Both girls nodded solemnly. The kidnapping attempt was still fresh in their memories, a trauma they were processing with the help of a child psychologist Rebecca had hired immediately afterward. "Well, there's something else about fathers that we need to talk about. Something I should have told you before now, but I was waiting until you were older and could understand better." Emma's expression grew serious. "Is it bad?" "It's not bad, sweetheart. It's just complicated. You know how Daddy James loved you and took care of you, and was your father in every way that mattered?" "Yes," Zoe said, her voice small. Even 2 years after James's death, talking about him still brought tears to both girls' eyes. "Well, Daddy James was your father because he chose to be. He adopted you when you were babies, which means he decided to be your daddy even though you weren't born from him. But every person has a biological father, someone whose body helped make them before they were born." Sophie took a step into the room, drawn despite her nervousness by the careful way Rebecca was handling such a difficult conversation. Marcus found himself holding his breath, waiting to see how the twins would process this information. "Like in science class?" Emma asked, "when Mrs. Garcia taught us about how babies are made from 2 people. "Exactly like that. Daddy James was the man who raised you and loved you, and chose to be your father. But your biological father, the man whose body helped make you, is someone different." Zoe looked up from the puzzle pieces, her small face scrunched in concentration. "Who is he?" Rebecca glanced at Marcus, and he saw the moment when she made the decision to tell them everything at once rather than drawing it out. "His name is Marcus, and he's standing right here," she said, gesturing toward the window where Marcus stood frozen. "Marcus is your biological father, which means he's part of why you exist. And Sophie is his daughter, which makes her your half-sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma and Zoe stared at Marcus with expressions that cycled through confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been recognition. Sophie remained near the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides as she waited for their reaction. It was Emma who spoke first, her voice thoughtful rather than upset. "Is that why you were so good at protecting us from Derek? Because you're our biological father?" Marcus moved closer to the table, his heart hammering in his chest. "I protected you because it was the right thing to do. Because children should always be kept safe. But yes, maybe some part of me knew there was a connection between us." "Did you know about us before Derek came?" Zoe asked, her analytical mind already working through the timeline. "No," Marcus said honestly. "I didn't know you existed until that day. Your mother never told me she was going to have babies." Both girls turned to look at Rebecca, and Marcus could see them processing this information with the straightforward logic children brought to adult complications. "Why didn't you tell him, Mommy?" Emma asked, Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because I was scared and young, and I thought I was making the best decision for everyone. I thought you would be safer and happier with Daddy James as your father, and I thought Marcus would be happier not knowing about you." "Were you right?" Zoe asked with devastating simplicity. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and heartbreaking in its directness. Rebecca looked at Marcus, then at Sophie, then back at her daughters. "I don't know, baby. I thought I was, but now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe we all would have been happier if we'd been together from the beginning." Sophie chose that moment to step forward, drawn by the twins' matter-of-fact acceptance of a situation that had seemed impossibly complicated to the adults. She said, her voice only slightly shaky. "I'm Sophie. I guess I'm your big sister." Emma and Zoe looked at her with the intense scrutiny they'd inherited from their mother. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Emma smiled. "Are you 15? She asked. "Yes. How did you know? You look like the girls in the high school shows on TV. Do you drive a car?" "Not yet, but I'm learning." Zoe abandoned her puzzle completely now, turning her chair to face Sophie directly. "Do you live with Marcus? I mean with our biological father." "I do. We have a little house in Scottsdale. It's not as big as this one, but it's nice. Can we see it sometime?" Emma asked, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion at the casual way she asked, as if visiting her biological father's house was the most natural thing in the world. "Maybe," Sophie said, glancing at the adults for guidance, "if everyone thinks it's a good idea." Marcus finally moved to join the conversation, pulling up another small chair and sitting down so he was at the twins' eye level. This close he could see even more clearly how much they resembled him, not just in bone structure but in small gestures and expressions he recognized from his own childhood. "I know this is confusing," he said, "and I know you probably have a lot of questions. But I want you to know that finding out about you has been the best surprise of my whole life." "Better than when Sophie was born?" Zoe asked. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed since entering the room. "Different from when Sophie was born. Sophie was the best surprise of my life 15 years ago. You two are the best surprise of my life now." Sophie looked at him sharply, and Marcus could see her processing the fact that her father was capable of loving other children without loving her any less. It was a complex emotional concept, but one she seemed to grasp intuitively. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Do we get to have two families, one with Mommy, and one with Marcus and Sophie?" Before anyone could answer, Mrs. Garcia appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic but urgent. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there are news vans pulling up to the front gate." The adults exchanged panicked glances. The story had broken faster than anyone had anticipated. Rebecca was on her feet immediately, moving to the window to look out at the front of the estate. Even from the playroom they could see the growing cluster of vehicles and reporters gathering beyond the security gates. "How many?" Marcus asked, joining her at the window. "At least 6 vans, and more arriving," Rebecca said, her voice tight with stress. "The security team is keeping them outside the gates, but it's only a matter of time before they start trying other approaches." Sophie moved to stand beside Emma and Zoe, who were watching the adults with growing concern. "Are those the people who write news stories?" Emma asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Rebecca said, "and they're here because they want to write a story about our family." "About Marcus being our biological father?" Zoe asked. "Among other things, yes." The twins exchanged one of their wordless twin communications, a conversation conducted entirely through facial expressions and slight gestures. Then Emma stood up and walked over to Marcus. "Are you going to stay and be our father now?" she asked, even with all the news people being here. The question cut straight to the heart of everything Marcus had been wrestling with since learning about the twins' existence. The practical challenges, the media attention, the complexity of blending two very different lives, all of it paled in comparison to the simple trust in Emma's voice. "If you want me to," he said. "If your mother is okay with it. If we can figure out how to make it work for everyone." "We want you to," Zoe said with characteristic decisiveness. "And we want Sophie to be our sister too." She looked at Sophie, who was still standing protectively near the twins despite her own emotional turmoil. "Will you teach us about being teenagers when we're older?" Sophie laughed, the sound breaking some of the tension in the room. "That's like 9 years away. I'll be ancient by then. You'll be 24. Emma calculated quickly. "That's not ancient, that's just grown up." Marcus felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for longer than he'd realized. Watching Sophie interact with the twins, seeing how naturally they'd accepted each other, he began to believe that maybe they could make this work despite all the complications. But Rebecca was still staring out the window at the growing media circus, her expression troubled. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I need to tell all of you before this goes any further." The tone of her voice made everyone in the room go still.
Marcus could see from her posture that whatever she was about to reveal was significant. The reason the media found out so quickly, the reason they're here now instead of in a few days or weeks, is because someone leaked the story deliberately. Who? Marcus asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Derek's lawyer. Apparently releasing the information about your paternity was part of their legal strategy. They're claiming that my relationship with you compromised the original paternity tests, that I had a motive to falsify the results to keep Derek away from the children. Marcus felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate. They're using our children as pawns in a legal game. It gets worse, Rebecca continued. The story they leaked to the press includes details about our college relationship, our engagement, the fact that I disappeared without telling you I was pregnant. They're painting me as someone who deliberately kept children from their father for selfish reasons. Sophie moved closer to the twins, her protective instincts clearly kicking in despite having known them for less than an hour. What does that mean for Emma and Zoe? It means they're going to be the center of a media storm that focuses on the most painful and private parts of our family's history, Rebecca said, her voice thick with guilt and worry. It means reporters are going to want to interview them, photographers are going to try to get pictures of them, and every detail of their lives is going to be scrutinized by strangers. The twins had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention they brought to all adult discussions, but Marcus could see confusion and fear beginning to creep into their expressions. Will the bad people be able to get to us? Zoe asked, clearly thinking about Derek and the kidnapping attempt. No, Marcus said firmly. The security here is excellent, and I'm going to make sure you're protected no matter what happens with the news stories. But what if they write mean things about Mommy? Emma asked, moving to stand beside Rebecca's chair. What if they say she's bad for not telling you about us? Rebecca knelt down and pulled both twins into a hug, her composure finally cracking. Some people might say mean things, yes, but the people who matter, the people who love us, they'll understand that sometimes adults make mistakes because they're scared, not because they're bad. Marcus watched this scene unfold, seeing the fear and confusion in his daughters' faces, and felt something crystallize in his mind. The media attention, the legal complications, the public scrutiny, all of it was going to happen whether they were prepared for it or not. But how they handled it, how they protected Emma and Zoe from the worst of it, that was still within their control. We need to get ahead of this, he said. If Derek's lawyer leaked a one-sided version of the story, we need to tell our side before the narrative gets completely out of our control. Rebecca looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we hold a press conference. Today. We tell our story ourselves, on our terms, with our own words. We control the narrative instead of letting Derek's lawyer control it for us. Marcus, the media attention that would bring, is going to happen anyway. But this way, we get to frame the story as what it actually is. A family reunion, not a scandal. Two people who found each other again through their children, not a woman who deliberately kept children from their father. Sophie looked up from where she was sitting with the twins. I think Marcus is right. If you don't tell your side, other people will tell it for you, and they'll get it wrong. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the options. Outside they could hear the sound of more vehicles arriving, more reporters setting up their equipment for a story that was going to be told with or without their cooperation. What about Emma and Zoe? She asked. I don't want them exposed to that kind of scrutiny. We don't include them in the press conference, Marcus said. We make it clear that they're off limits, that any media outlet that bothers them, or tries to photograph them without permission will face legal consequences. Emma looked up from her mother's embrace. What's a press conference? It's when people talk to the news reporters to tell them what really happened, Sophie explained. Like when the president talks on TV to explain important things. Will you tell them that Marcus is our biological father, and that we're happy about it? Zoe asked. The simple question cut through all the adult complications and fears, focusing on what actually mattered. These children had just learned that their understanding of their family was incomplete, and their primary concern was making sure everyone knew they were happy about the new additions to their lives. Yes, Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger. We'll tell them exactly that. 2 hours later, Marcus found himself standing beside Rebecca in front of the Whitmore estate, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Sophie was inside with the twins and Mrs. Garcia, under strict instructions to stay away from windows and not answer any phones or doors. Rebecca had changed into a navy blue suit that projected both professionalism and authority, while Marcus wore the same tactical clothing he'd been wearing when he'd first saved the twins from Derek. They decided that presenting him as the security professional who'd protected the children first, and the biological father second, would help frame the story in terms of heroism rather than scandal. David Morrison, Rebecca's lawyer, had prepared a statement that hit the key points they wanted to emphasize. The truth about the twins' paternity, the circumstances that had led to Marcus being unaware of their existence, the recent kidnapping attempt that had brought the family back together, and their commitment to co-parenting in the children's best interests. But standing there in front of the cameras, Marcus realized that no prepared statement could capture the complexity of what they'd all been through, or the hope he felt for what they might build together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, "Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Chen have a statement to make regarding recent events involving Mrs. Whitmore's children." Rebecca stepped forward first, her voice clear and steady, as she faced the crowd of reporters. 8 years ago, I made a decision that I thought was in everyone's best interests, but that I now realize caused pain and separation that could have been avoided. When I learned I was pregnant with twins, I was young and overwhelmed, and I chose not to tell their biological father about their existence. She paused, allowing the cameras to capture her words before continuing. "That biological father is Marcus Chen, the security professional who recently protected my daughters from a kidnapping attempt. Marcus had no knowledge of the twins' existence until this week, when a combination of circumstances brought us back together." Marcus stepped forward, taking his cue from the prepared statement but speaking from his heart. "Learning that I have 2 daughters has been the greatest joy, and the greatest shock of my life. Emma and Zoe are remarkable children, brave and intelligent and loving, and I'm grateful beyond words for the opportunity to be part of their lives going forward." The questions came fast and aggressive, reporters shouting over each other to get Marcus and Rebecca's attention. "Mr. Chen, are you angry that Miss Whitmore kept your children from you? Mrs. Whitmore, why didn't you tell Mr. Chen about his daughters? Is this a romantic reunion, or strictly about the children? What role will Mr. Chen play in the children's lives going forward?" Rebecca and Marcus had anticipated most of these questions, but hearing them shouted by strangers in front of cameras made them feel more invasive and accusatory than they'd expected. "The focus of our attention is and always will be Emma and Zoe's well-being," Rebecca said, her voice firm. "Any decisions we make going forward will be based on what's best for them, not on what makes good headlines." Marcus stepped closer to the microphones. "I want to be clear about something." Rebecca made the best decision she could with the information she had at the time. She was 22 years old, facing an unplanned pregnancy, and trying to provide the most stable possible life for her children. "I may not agree with every choice that was made, but I understand why those choices were made." It wasn't the angry condemnation the reporters had been hoping for, and Marcus could see the disappointment on some of their faces. A story about forgiveness and family reunion didn't generate as many clicks as a story about betrayal and custody battles. "What about Derek Hawkins' claims that the original paternity tests were falsified?" a reporter called out. Morrison stepped forward to field this question. "New paternity tests will be conducted as ordered by the court. We're confident that these tests will confirm what the original tests showed, that Mr. Hawkins has no biological relationship to the children." "And what about Mr. Chen's relationship to the children? Will those results be made public?" "Mr. Chen's paternity has been confirmed through private testing," Morrison replied. "The results of any court-ordered tests will be handled according to legal requirements." The questions continued for another 20 minutes, but Marcus found himself barely listening. His attention kept drifting to the house behind them, where Emma and Zoe were probably watching cartoons or working on puzzles, blissfully unaware of the media circus analyzing their family situation. When the press conference finally ended, Marcus and Rebecca walked back toward the house in silence, both of them drained by the experience of having their most private matters discussed in front of strangers. "How do you think that went?" Rebecca asked as they reached the front door. "Better than it could have," Marcus replied. We told our story, we presented a united front, and we made it clear that the children's welfare comes first. Inside they found Sophie, Emma and Zoe in the kitchen, where Mrs. Garcia had apparently decided that making cookies was the best distraction from the chaos outside. All three girls were covered in flour, and the kitchen counter was a disaster zone of mixing bowls and chocolate chips. How did it go? Sophie asked, looking up from the cookie dough she was rolling into balls. It went fine, Marcus said, not wanting to get into the details in front of the twins. The important thing is that we told our side of the story. Emma looked up from her own cookie preparation. Did you tell them we're happy that you're our biological father? We did, Rebecca said, moving to wash her hands before joining in the cookie-making process. We told them that this is a happy story, not a sad one. Zoe considered this for a moment, her small face serious. Even if some people try to make it sad.
Even then, Marcus confirmed. Because the truth is that finding each other has made all of us happier, and that's what really matters. As the afternoon wore on and the reporters gradually dispersed from outside the gates, Marcus found himself settling into the domestic rhythm of life with the twins. He helped with cookie decoration, listened to their chatter about school projects and favorite books, and marveled at how quickly they'd accepted him as part of their family. Sophie seemed to be adjusting as well, slipping into the role of big sister with surprising ease. She answered Emma and Zoe's endless questions about teenage life, helped them with their art projects, and showed them pictures on her phone of the house she shared with Marcus. But it was the moment when Zoe fell asleep against his shoulder while they were all watching a movie that Marcus felt the full weight of what his life had become. This small person, who shared his DNA and his stubbornness, and apparently his tendency to fall asleep in uncomfortable positions, trusted him completely despite having known him for less than a week. Rebecca, sitting on the other end of the couch with Emma curled up beside her, caught his eye and smiled. It was a smile that acknowledged the strangeness of their situation, the complications that still lay ahead, and the unexpected joy of being together despite everything. They had a long way to go before they figured out how to make this unconventional family work. There would be legal proceedings to navigate, media attention to manage, and the complex logistics of co-parenting across two very different lifestyles. But sitting there in the quiet living room, with his daughters asleep and Sophie and Rebecca nearby, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. He felt complete. 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, Marcus Chen stood in the backyard of a house he never could have imagined owning, watching his 3 daughters play together on a swing set that cost more than his old truck. The transition from his duplex in Scottsdale to this sprawling property in Paradise Valley had been Rebecca's idea, a compromise that put them all under one roof while maintaining separate living spaces for the complex dynamics they were still navigating. The house itself was a study in careful architecture designed for blended families. Marcus and Sophie had their own wing with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area that felt like home. Rebecca and the twins occupied the main house, with its soaring ceilings and elegant furnishings. But the spaces flowed together seamlessly, connected by walkways and shared areas that encouraged interaction without forcing it. Sophie was pushing Emma and Zoe on swings that had been installed at different heights to accommodate the age gap between them. At 16 now, Sophie had grown into her role as big sister with remarkable grace, serving as translator between the adult world and the twins' 6-year-old perspective. She was also applying to colleges with Marcus's full support, something that would have been impossible on his security consultant salary, but was now within reach, thanks to the scholarship fund Rebecca had quietly established. The legal proceedings with Derek had concluded 2 months ago, with him receiving a 10-year sentence for kidnapping and assault. The new paternity tests had confirmed what everyone already knew, that Marcus was the twins' biological father and Derek had no claim to them whatsoever. More importantly, the media attention had gradually shifted to other stories, leaving the family to build their new life with relative privacy. Emma ran over from the swings, her face flushed with excitement and grass stains on her shorts. "Dad, can we show you the fort we built in the desert garden?" The casual way she called him Dad still made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion. It had taken about 3 weeks after the truth came out for both twins to start using the title naturally, as if they'd simply been waiting for permission to acknowledge what they'd somehow sensed from the beginning. "Lead the way," Marcus said, following Emma toward the section of the yard where native desert plants created a natural playground among carefully placed boulders and walking paths. The fort turned out to be an elaborate construction of fallen branches and tumbleweeds, held together with what appeared to be an entire roll of duct tape. Zoe emerged from inside the structure, her hair decorated with small twigs and a satisfied expression on her face. "We made it completely weatherproof," she announced proudly. "Sophie helped us engineer the roof angle for optimal rain runoff." Marcus caught sight of Rebecca watching from the kitchen window and waved her over to see their daughter's architectural achievement. She emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade and wearing the kind of casual clothes she'd never owned during her marriage to James. The transformation in her had been as remarkable as the physical changes to their living situation. "This is impressive construction," Rebecca said, examining the fort with the seriousness the twins' project deserved. "Did you get building permits from the homeowners association?" Emma giggled at the joke, but Zoe considered the question seriously. "Do we actually need permits for temporary structures on our own property?" "No, sweetheart," Rebecca assured her. "I was just teasing." They settled into chairs on the patio, the twins disappearing back into their fort while Sophie claimed the hammock strung between two mesquite trees. The afternoon sun was beginning to soften, casting long shadows across the desert landscape that surrounded their home. "David Morrison called this morning," Rebecca said, referring to her lawyer. "The custody arrangements have been finalized by the court. Officially, we have joint custody with a flexible schedule based on the children's needs and preferences." Marcus nodded. The legal formalities had been necessary, but they bore little resemblance to how they actually functioned as a family. Emma and Zoe moved freely between both parts of the house, often falling asleep in whatever room they happened to be in when exhaustion overtook them. Sophie had claimed the guest room in the main house as her homework space, saying she concentrated better in Rebecca's study than in her own room. "Any word on the trust fund modifications?" Marcus asked. Rebecca had been working with her financial advisors to restructure James's inheritance for the twins, ensuring that Marcus would have equal say in decisions about their education and future without actually accessing the money himself. It was a delicate balance that respected James's memory while acknowledging the reality of their new family structure. "Everything should be finalized by the end of the month. The twins will have access to their inheritance when they turn 21, but all major decisions about their education and well-being will require both our signatures." It was more money than Marcus could have imagined when he was growing up in his working-class family, but he'd learned that wealth brought its own complications. The twins would never want for anything material, but they'd also never experience the character-building challenges that came from having to work for what they wanted. "I've been thinking about Emma's question yesterday," Rebecca said. "About whether we're going to get married." The question had been inevitable, asked with the straightforward curiosity 6-year-olds brought to all adult relationships. Emma had wanted to know if having the same children meant Marcus and Rebecca would become husband and wife like in the movies she watched. "What did you tell her?" Marcus asked. "That marriage is something adults decide based on whether they want to be partners for their whole lives, not just because they have children together." She seemed satisfied with that explanation. Marcus studied Rebecca's face, looking for clues about her own feelings on the subject. Their relationship had evolved significantly over the past 6 months, moving from the awkward politeness of co-parents to something warmer and more complex. They'd fallen into comfortable routines, shared responsibilities and private jokes, and gradually rebuilt the trust that had been broken 8 years ago. But neither of them had explicitly discussed whether their partnership might become romantic again, whether the love that had once brought them together could survive the years of separation and the complications of their current situation. "What do you think?" he asked. "About marriage, I mean." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, watching the twins emerge from their fort and race toward the playground equipment. "I think we're building something good here, something that works for all of us. I'm not sure we need to change the structure just because other people expect us to." Marcus felt both relief and disappointment at her answer. Relief because the pressure to define their relationship was lifted, disappointment because some part of him had been hoping she felt the same growing attraction he'd been experiencing. But Rebecca continued, and something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "I also think that if two people care about each other the way I've come to care about you again, maybe the structure isn't as important as the commitment."
The words hung in the desert air between them, loaded with possibility and hope. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he processed what she might be saying. "Rebecca, I'm not proposing to you," she said quickly, a flush rising in her cheeks. "I'm just saying that what we have here feels like more than co-parenting. It feels like partnership. Like family, like something worth making permanent." Sophie's voice interrupted from the hammock. "Are you two going to keep talking around each other forever, or are you going to figure out that you're basically already married in everything but name?" Both adults turned to stare at the teenager, who was grinning at them from behind a book she was pretending to read. "How long have you been listening?" Marcus asked. "Long enough to know that you're both being ridiculous. You live in the same house, you raise children together, you make decisions as a team, and you're clearly crazy about each other. The only thing missing is the official paperwork." Emma's voice piped up from the fort. "What paperwork?" "Nothing, sweetie," Rebecca called back. "Sophie's just giving us advice about adult stuff." "Is it good advice?" Zoe asked, emerging from the fort with her hair even more disheveled than before. Marcus looked at Rebecca, seeing his own emotions reflected in her eyes. Love, yes, but also uncertainty and fear and the weight of responsibility for not just their own happiness but their children's well-being. "Yeah," he said finally. "It might be very good advice." That evening, after the twins had gone to bed, and Sophie had retreated to her room with homework and teenage privacy needs, Marcus found Rebecca in the kitchen making tea. The house was quiet except for the soft sounds of evening settling over the desert. "So," she said without looking up from the kettle, "Sophie thinks we should get married." Sophie thinks a lot of things, most of them turn out to be right, which is terrifying for a parent. Rebecca laughed, the sound light and genuinely happy. "She gets that from both sides. You were always too perceptive for your own good, and apparently I've raised daughters who inherited that trait." Marcus moved to stand beside her at the counter, close enough to catch the scent of her perfume. "What do you think? Not about what Sophie thinks we should do, but about what you want to do." Rebecca turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "I think I spent 8 years convincing myself I could live without you, and I never really managed it. I think finding you again, getting to see you with Emma and Zoe, watching you be the father I always knew you'd be, has reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I think I'd rather spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with you than wondering what we might have had if we'd been brave enough to try." Marcus covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her skin, and the rightness of the moment. "I love you. I never stopped loving you, even when I was angry, even when I thought I'd moved on. You and our girls, you're my family. You're my home." The kiss that followed was soft and sweet and tasted like forgiveness and second chances. When they broke apart, Rebecca rested her forehead against his, both of them smiling. "So is that a yes?" she asked. "That's definitely a yes, but I have one condition." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "I want to do this right. I want to propose to you properly, not just decide to get married while making tea in the kitchen. You and the girls deserve something special, something that marks this as the beginning of our official forever." Rebecca's smile grew brighter. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus glanced toward the backyard, where the twins' fort was visible through the window. "I have some ideas, but I'm going to need Sophie's help, and probably Emma and Zoe's too. A family proposal. A family everything. This isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about all of us choosing to be together permanently." 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in the desert garden, where Emma and Zoe's fort had been expanded into an elaborate structure that now included fairy lights, cushions, and a hand-painted sign that read "Family Meeting Place." Rebecca approached from the house, led by Sophie and the twins, who had spent days planning what they called Operation Forever Family. The proposal itself was simple and heartfelt, delivered not just to Rebecca, but to all 3 girls, asking them to be his family officially and permanently. Emma and Zoe's enthusiastic yes was immediate and loud. Sophie's agreement came with tears and a hug that nearly knocked Marcus over. Rebecca's yes was quieter, delivered with the kind of smile that lit up her entire face and made Marcus remember why he'd fallen in love with her 17 years ago in a college lecture hall. The wedding took place 3 months later in the same desert garden, with only family and close friends in attendance. Emma and Zoe served as flower girls, dropping rose petals with the serious concentration they brought to all important tasks. Sophie was Rebecca's maid of honor, having declared that traditional wedding roles needed updating for modern blended families. Mrs. Garcia, who had become something like a grandmother to all three girls, officiated the ceremony after getting ordained online specifically for the occasion. Her speech about family being defined by love rather than biology brought tears to most of the small gathering. But it was the moment when Marcus and Rebecca exchanged rings, with Emma and Zoe standing beside them as part of the ceremony, that truly marked the beginning of their official life as a family. The rings were simple bands engraved with coordinates, marking the location of their desert garden, the place where they'd built their new beginning together. As the sun set over their celebration and the desert stars began to appear overhead, Marcus found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A kidnapping attempt that had revealed hidden truths, a media circus that had tested their resolve, and months of careful rebuilding that had created something stronger than what they'd lost 8 years ago. Emma and Zoe were asleep in the fort they'd insisted on keeping even after the wedding, surrounded by the fairy lights that had transformed it from a childhood hideout into something magical. Sophie was nearby in the hammock, reading by lamplight and keeping watch over her little sisters. Rebecca emerged from the house carrying 2 glasses of champagne, and wearing the kind of contented expression Marcus had dreamed of seeing on her face for months. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling beside him on the patio furniture they'd arranged for optimal fort watching. Marcus looked around at the life they'd built together, at the sleeping children who called him dad, at the teenager who'd welcomed her half-sisters with open arms, at the woman who'd given him a second chance at the family he'd always wanted. "Only one," he said, accepting the champagne and raising his glass in a toast. "I regret that it took us 8 years to get here." Rebecca clinked her glass against his, her eyes bright with happiness and possibility. "Maybe we needed those 8 years to become the people who could build this." As they sat together in the desert evening, surrounded by the family they'd created from the pieces of broken dreams and second chances, Marcus knew she was right. Sometimes the best things in life came not when you expected them, but when you were finally ready to receive them. The fort in the garden would eventually be replaced by other childhood projects, as Emma and Zoe grew older. Sophie would leave for college and return with stories of her own adventures and relationships. There would be challenges ahead, decisions to navigate, and the ordinary difficulties that came with any family. But tonight, under the Arizona stars, with his daughter sleeping safely nearby, and his wife's hand in his, Marcus Chen was exactly where he belonged. 3 years had passed since the wedding in the desert garden, and the Chen Whitmore household had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Marcus stood in the doorway of what had once been Rebecca's formal dining room, now transformed into a homework command center where 3 very different academic needs could be managed simultaneously. Sophie, now 19, and home from Arizona State University for winter break, was tutoring 9-year-old Zoe in algebra concepts that wouldn't normally be introduced until middle school. Zoe's mathematical mind had proven to be remarkably advanced, a trait that both impressed and occasionally worried her parents. Emma sat at the opposite end of the large table, surrounded by art supplies and working on what appeared to be an architectural drawing of their house, complete with measurements and detailed structural notes. Her artistic talents had developed alongside a fascination with engineering that made her teacher suggest she might want to consider studying both fields in college. The transformation of the house itself reflected how thoroughly the family had blended over the years. Rebecca's once pristine spaces now showed the comfortable wear of daily life with children. Marcus's practical additions, like the mudroom where soccer cleats and backpacks could be stored without ceremony, had been seamlessly integrated into the home's elegant design. "Dad, can you check my math on the roof angles?" Emma called out, not looking up from her drawing. "I'm trying to figure out if we could install solar panels without compromising the aesthetic." Marcus moved to examine her work, impressed as always by the precision of her drawings. "The calculations look correct, but you might want to consider the seasonal sun angles too. Arizona gets different light patterns than what you've drawn here." "Already accounted for," Emma said, flipping to another page that showed detailed shadow studies for different times of year. "I also researched the county regulations for residential solar installations and calculated the potential energy savings." From across the table, Sophie grinned. "She's going to put us all to shame when she gets to high school." Zoe looked up from her algebra problems.
The blue Toyota Camry occupied spot 183, its fresh wax job standing out among the weather-worn vehicles. Mark had chosen this parking garage carefully, noting how the security cameras covered every corner of level 2. Emma's always been the practical one. I'm more interested in theoretical applications. Marcus marveled at how his daughters had grown into their individual personalities while maintaining the close bond they'd shared since early childhood. Emma had become the family's problem solver, always looking for ways to improve or fix whatever situation presented itself. Zoe had developed into a philosophical thinker who could discuss abstract concepts with the seriousness of a graduate student. Sophie had evolved into something like a bridge between the adult world and her younger sisters, translating teenage experiences and helping Emma and Zoe navigate the complexities of growing up in a blended family that attracted occasional media attention. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, returning from her afternoon run through the desert trails that connected their property to the state park beyond. She'd taken up running as a way to manage the stress of balancing CEO responsibilities with active motherhood, and the physical activity had given her a confidence and energy that made her seem younger than her 41 years. "How's the homework supervision going?" she asked, accepting the water bottle Marcus handed her. Sophie's explaining calculus concepts to a 9-year-old, and Emma's designing renewable energy solutions for our house, Marcus reported. "Just another typical Thursday afternoon. What about college applications?" Rebecca asked Sophie. "Any decisions about graduate school?" Sophie had surprised everyone by choosing to study social work rather than business or law, despite having opportunities in both fields. Her work with veterans' families through a university internship program had shown her a calling that none of them had anticipated. "I've been accepted to the master's program at ASU," Sophie said, "but I'm also considering taking a gap year to work with that organization in Denver that helps military families with PTSD. Marcus felt the familiar mix of pride and concern that came with watching his oldest daughter make increasingly independent decisions. Sophie had grown into a remarkable young woman, compassionate and intelligent and unafraid to tackle difficult challenges. "What does your gut tell you?" he asked, the same question he'd been asking her since she was old enough to make her own choices. "That maybe some experiences are more valuable than rushing through formal education," Sophie replied. "The families I've worked with this year, they need advocates who understand what deployment and trauma do to entire family systems, not just individual soldiers." Emma looked up from her drawings. "Are you going to help families like ours? Ones where parents have to figure out complicated situations?" The question showed the perceptive nature Emma had inherited from both sides of her biological family. At 9, she understood that their household structure was unusual, that not every family had to navigate the dynamics of blended parentage and significant wealth alongside the ordinary challenges of childhood. "All families are complicated in their own ways," Sophie said diplomatically. "But yes, I think I'd like to help people figure out how to make things work when the traditional approaches don't fit their situation." Marcus exchanged a look with Rebecca, both of them recognizing that Sophie's career choice had been influenced by watching them navigate their own unconventional path to becoming a family. That evening, after homework was finished, and the girls had settled into their respective evening routines, Marcus found Rebecca in their bedroom, reading financial reports while simultaneously researching summer camp options for the twins. "Multitasking again?" he asked, settling beside her on the bed they'd shared for 3 years. "Emma wants to attend engineering camp, but Zoe's interested in philosophy programs for gifted children. I'm trying to find something that would challenge them both without separating them for the whole summer." Marcus took the camp brochures from her hands and set them on the nightstand. "They're 9, Rebecca. They don't need to have their entire futures planned out this year." "I know, but the opportunities available to them now are so much greater than what either of us had at their age. I don't want to waste their potential by being too casual about their education." The conversation touched on one of the ongoing challenges in their marriage. Rebecca's wealth meant their children would never face the financial constraints that had shaped both Marcus and Rebecca's own childhoods, but it also meant they had to be intentional about ensuring Emma and Zoe developed work ethic and resilience. Remember what Sophie said about experiences being more valuable than rushing through formal education. Marcus reminded her, maybe the twins need more time to just be kids before we start optimizing their intellectual development. Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that still made Marcus feel grateful for the second chance they'd been given. You're right, I just want to give them every advantage, and sometimes I forget that being overscheduled isn't necessarily an advantage. They're already brilliant and curious and kind, Marcus said. Those are the things that matter most. Outside their bedroom window, the desert landscape stretched toward mountains that were barely visible in the starlight. This view had become as familiar as the one from his childhood bedroom in Ohio, but it represented a life Marcus never could have imagined when he was struggling as a single parent in Scottsdale. The security consulting business he'd built had evolved into a family enterprise, with Rebecca's business connections providing opportunities to work with clients who needed more comprehensive protection services. Sophie had suggested they establish a foundation focused on supporting veterans' families, using some of Rebecca's resources to address the kinds of challenges Marcus had faced as a single father. I've been thinking about Derek, Rebecca said quietly, referring to the man who had inadvertently brought their family together through his misguided attempt at kidnapping. What about him? He gets out of prison in 4 years. The girls will be teenagers then, old enough to understand more about what happened and why. I wonder if we should be preparing them for the possibility that he might try to contact them again. Marcus had been wondering the same thing. Derek's obsession with the twins had been the catalyst for Marcus discovering his fatherhood, but it had also been a genuine threat to their safety. The man's fixation on claiming children who weren't his had been rooted in delusion rather than malice, but delusion could be just as dangerous. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Marcus said. Right now they're safe and happy and surrounded by people who love them. That's what matters today. Rebecca nodded, but Marcus could see she was still processing the complexities of protecting children who would inherit both great privilege and the challenges that came with public attention. A soft knock on their bedroom door interrupted the conversation. Emma peeked inside, her hair in braids that had started neat but were now showing the effects of a full day of activity. Can't sleep? Rebecca asked, making space for Emma to climb onto the bed between them. I was thinking about Sophie going away to help other families, Emma said. Will she still be our sister when she's living somewhere else? The question revealed the 9-year-old anxiety about family bonds that could survive physical separation. Emma had spent her entire conscious life with Sophie as a presence in their house, and the prospect of that changing felt threatening to her sense of security. Family isn't about living in the same place, Marcus explained, pulling Emma closer. It's about caring for each other and being there when someone needs support, even if you have to travel to do it. Like how you and Mommy found each other again after being apart for a long time. The comparison made both adults smile. Emma's ability to connect abstract concepts to her own family's story showed the kind of intelligence that would serve her well regardless of which career path she eventually chose. Exactly like that, Rebecca said. Sometimes being apart for a while makes families stronger because it helps everyone appreciate what they have together. Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation, snuggling deeper between her parents with the unconscious trust children showed when they felt completely secure. As Emma drifted toward sleep, Marcus reflected on how much their definition of family had expanded and evolved over the past few years. It now included Mrs. Garcia, who had become a grandmother figure to all 3 girls. It included Rebecca's business associates who had become genuine friends. It included Sophie's college roommates, who spent holidays with them and treated Emma and Zoe like beloved younger siblings. Most importantly, it included the community of other blended families they'd connected with through support groups and social organizations. Marcus had discovered that their situation, while unique in its specifics, was part of a larger pattern of modern families creating new structures based on love and commitment, rather than traditional models. She's asleep, Rebecca whispered, noticing Emma's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of childhood slumber. They carried Emma back to her room, tucking her into bed beside the architectural drawings she'd been working on earlier. Zoe was already deeply asleep in the twin bed across the room, one arm flung across a mathematics textbook she'd been reading for pleasure. Standing in the doorway of their daughter's room, Marcus felt the profound contentment that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The journey to this point had been unexpected and sometimes difficult, but it had led to a richness of family life he never could have planned or anticipated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, school projects and business meetings, the ongoing work of raising 3 exceptional daughters while maintaining the marriage that had been rebuilt from the foundation of shared children and rediscovered love. But tonight, in the quiet house where his family slept safely, Marcus Chen was grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together and every choice they'd made to stay together. The desert stars shone down on Paradise Valley, on a house where love had proven stronger than time and distance, where children grew up knowing they were wanted and valued, where second chances had bloomed into lifetime commitments. It was more than Marcus had ever dared to dream, and it was exactly enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.